And welcome to Commercial Real Estate Today. Happy that you're with us. I've got a very special guest with us today, also a friend of mine. She is the division head of commercial realty at Exit Real Estate Gallery, Nicole Ryan. Nicole, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Wally.
So it's been often said that residential real estate is about adjectives. Commercial real estate is about numbers. Mm-hmm. Your fascination as well as skill set with numbers and detail and just a laser focus on process. How did this begin? Did this begin as a young girl, through school? Where did this come from?
So my background tied to getting into commercial real estate was I have about 17 years of experience in commercial and residential underwriting. So the skill set on being able to look at financials and run projections and understand where those numbers come from is really my background. Prior to getting into real estate, the sales piece came second. So it's something that organically made sense for me to do.
And that's interesting because most lead either with an aptitude for sales or an interest in real estate, and the numbers, the cash flow needs to be hammered in. For you, you already had that foundation just to lay on a little layer of sales and a fascination with buildings, and off you go. The specific area of real estate that you've been concentrating in as an underwriter, what did you see most of those transactions centered on? The industrial, office, in any special category that seemed to dominate?
No, because it was all types of commercial real estate that came through the companies that I was with. However, multifamily and apartment buildings and office buildings with 4 or 5 offices seemed to be what would be in front of me the most often.
So if you took that decade of experience as an underwriter, seeing some of the garbage would be an inappropriate term, but the incomplete submission of documents to get loans closed that basically made it through the scrutiny of the commercial agent. What are the 1, 2, 3 things that you would share with your cohorts as commercial real estate agents that they can do to really streamline, accelerate, and crunch the time taken for that commercial underwriting?
Understanding a balance sheet, understanding a profit and loss statement. Those are the biggest two, to make sure that their year-to-date are in line with what their tax returns are. Even in relation to leasing and applications that you get in, a lot of times they're going to want to see 2 to 3 years of financials. So being able to look at the net income and learning or asking somebody to assist them on knowing how to speak to their customers or clients and what they can add back into that net so that you can get a really good encompassing picture of what's there is very important. Also, what's very important is having a really good understanding in relation to where they stand in relation to their business model and their business planning and what they have already, make sure that they have a really good picture of where their business is heading prior to starting to show them spaces, and making sure that their income and their goals are in line with each other with that.
Well, given that many business owners are very, very good at doing the work of their business, they're often not very good at things like business planning and having those financials in order. Rather, they dump a metaphorical shoebox on their accountant at the end of the year. What would you say to those business owners who are about to look toward purchase of their own space or about to change or upgrade that lease space to get their finances in order? That is, the documentation in order. How can you help them there?
Yep. I call myself a good connector. I'm more of a connector than anything else within our industry. So it's really each relationship that I get into, and any commercial real estate agent that gets into, it's all about that initial consultation and having a really clear picture of where they stand and where you see some of those shortcomings, or anything that we can add relationships that we've made along the way with them. So if it's a bookkeeper, if it's a good CPA, if it's somebody that does assist in drafting business plans with them, sometimes they don't even know what type of zoning or what type of building or what type of use they really need to be able to be approved for, and being able to assist, really just put them in contact with the right people who can assist them professionally is probably what I do more than anything else.
As a person who lists a good amount of commercial space, how often are you confronted with a scenario where the agent working with the buyer has actually brought the customer, who then gets excited about the wrong space where the use isn't appropriate or the math doesn't work? How often do you run into that?
Right now, we're running into that on a very regular basis. A lot of property that we have right now, a lot of tenants are being asked to leave their existing spaces that they're in because they did not go after the appropriate certificate of use from the beginning. They weren't guided appropriately with the professionals they hired from the beginning that are there. That's a big hot item happening right now within the city, especially with churches. There's a lot of displaced churches right now. Almost half of the people that I'm working with are actually churches right now because they've been asked to leave their space they're in, and they're needing somebody to guide them and put them into an appropriate space that will set them up to succeed in their existing space. But a lot of times, even with the certificate of use, you have to have an architecture real plan in place. You have to be able to speak with the city ahead of time. You need a punch list of what you need to make sure that your space has appropriately, and they just need somebody that can assist them in making sure they're looking for the right things in each space that they go to. Something as simple as the way they can evacuate the building, and if there's sidewalks around the building, and if there's somebody that doesn't have the appropriate experience that's assisting them, it can set them up financially to fail.
So I would imagine as the leaseholder in that position, they're harmed when this occurs. If they've got to go, they've got to go. Or if there's an unexpected expense to bring a building into compliance.
And they're still accountable for the lease that they're in.
Correct. When people feel harmed or aggrieved, whether it's real or perceived, they seek relief from somewhere. Is there a place that typical comes? There's no reasonable reason to think they're looking for relief from the landlord. The landlord presented the property in all good faith and ideally accurate through their agent. The agent that was working with that now tenant, how do we resolve that? That's a tough one.
It's a very tough one, and I'm not going to give you the appropriate answer on that one. So a lot of it depends on it depends on the relationship that they had in place when they started looking, if it was a single agent transaction or a transaction broker, if it was a realtor who has to follow a code of ethics, if it's a real estate agent who does not on the commercial side. That is almost more than half of the agents that are out there. So it all comes down to how their relationship started. There really is not any protections in place for a tenant or a buyer, though. Commercial real estate is truly buyer beware. You're expected to have a team in place that's going to do the appropriate due diligence for you, and if it's not done, it's not like residential real estate where there are some protections and there are alternate ways to get some of that recourse. You don't really get a lot of that in the commercial side. There's some. You can talk to a good litigation attorney. You can bring all of your contracts through. Hopefully you work with a really decent landlord that can assist you in getting up to where you need to go, or a building owner. But if you're purchasing a building, once you own it, you own it. So really then you're going to be talking to professionals on how you can choose to sell it or lease it.
Yeah, clearly a strong difference there between residential, commercial, and I've watched that from our own business perspective. On the residential side, there's a presumption that the buyer, as well as seller, are innocents. Without knowledge, and the doubt tends to go in their favor.
Absolutely.
In the commercial, there's a presumption that there is a sophistication, there is experience, there has been due diligence,
Correct.
And a team of guidance. It tends to be a much less forgiving environment.
It absolutely.
The change of use, in your experience, is that typically driven by that tenant and agent looking to come into a space and cause it to comply, or is that more often, in your experience, a contingency where the buyer is asking of the seller, if you aid or can get this change in use, we're moving forward? How does that usually play out in your experience?
So everything's negotiable in commercial real estate, so it's 50-50. Half of the time they'll ask to be allowed, especially if it's a purchase that's happening, they'll ask to be allowed to have those discussions with the city. They have usually a 30 or 45-day due diligence window where they can get a really good understanding of what their probability of allowance is. Sometimes they can change that and go ahead and apply for that while they're in their due diligence period and trying to purchase it, if the owner allows. Once you change the use is the use. So a lot of times the existing owner won't let you do any of those changes until after the contract. But depending on the owner and how long they've had it for sale and how motivated they are to sell, a lot of times they will allow you to do that. If you have a good agent, though, they already have good contacts in place where you're able to go and have all of those meetings and pretty much know what's going to be allowed or not allowed. The zoning is the zoning. And so there, if it's existing, unless you're planning on changing zoning and use, you have a really good understanding that as long as you can modify that space to meet the guidelines that the city places on you, it's pretty easy to get the certificate of use allowed.
Let's talk about due diligence. Due diligence can be expensive.
Very expensive.
And in that due diligence path, while we're spending time, we're spending money. Time isn't good for either side. Money isn't good to be spent for the person who's spending it. What is a typical sequencing of the due diligence to respect expedience on one hand and getting to red light, green light as quickly as possible so we can stop burning time and stop burning money if we're ultimately going to get to a red light? What do you see as the sequencing?
It depends on the type
Is
of
it
property.
finance? Is it physical condition? Is it use? Is it zoning? How do you typically
All
begin?
of that plays in. Usually financing, you're going to want to have all of those conversations with your lender prior to going and starting to look at property, especially right now. Non-owner occupied, for example, is very difficult to get financing on. Churches is very difficult to get financing on. Multifamily is starting to come back, but it had been difficult for a while. So you want to have a good relationship with your lender. Because in some cases, it could make sense to only look at properties that are doing owner financing or non-owner financing, or what you have to put down within a property.
Lead with revenue.
Lead with revenue, absolutely. Then you're going to want to look at the zoning and make sure rezoning is a process. I know that you have family that is really heavily involved in that, and if you don't have a very good understanding and the right relationships within the city and within the government on being able to help streamline that and make that a quicker process, then you're going to want to go ahead and only look at properties that your business can probably fit within. Then you're going to want to look at environmentals. Environmentals are the responsibility of whoever owns the property. Again, in commercial real estate, if you choose to not go through the appropriate phase 1 and phase 2 and remediation pieces that are there, you're ultimately responsible for that the moment the city finds out that there's anything wrong with that property, because you should have done that due diligence at the beginning. Something that I've used you for a lot, Wally, is just very high level when people are just considering a couple of products, is the report that you can pull through the computer for a couple $100, where you can just have a very high level understanding of what the neighborhood allows and has within, and you can speak to that more so than
Right. It's doing the data search side of the phase 1 before doing the full phase 1. So
Absolutely.
the data is very inexpensive to acquire. Doing the entirety of the whole phase 1 is in that $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 range, where the data is $100, $200, depending on the sophistication. So you're right, that does play out real well. Something that people often don't consider, certainly a commercial real estate agent, sophisticated agent, has well considered, but anytime there's a request for a zoning change, it isn't the request by the requestor to the city that's the issue. The issue is these surrounding neighbors, be they residential, industrial, retail, bankers, church, whatever they are, typically are not in favor of the change. It's adversarial.
especially if you're going into industrial, for example, or if you have a salvage yard. There's a lot of salvage companies here in town. If any of that, usually industrial base, manufacturing base, a lot of people don't want to add to any of that additional zoning. They want to keep the zoning that they have.
How much challenge have you seen lately? Two issues that I see constantly come up, even if there's not a request for a change in use or change in zoning, is parking and stormwater. How early in the process, if there's any thought of changing parking or any chance of occupancy or throughput into that building, how soon are you working on that?
We're also doing that during the due diligence. So after environmentals have been considered and the building has been inspected itself to see if they want to move forward with that project, we put them in place with the appropriate people that talks about any of their setback requirements, any cement plans that they plan on placing on the property, if they plan on needing roundabouts or additional entrances in and out of the property. We go ahead and have them meet with the appropriate planners that can assist them with exactly what they do need to do. I had a storage facility that was right next to a highway, and the highway allowed two lots on either side of them to do some backfilling into some spaces. So the property that we were under contract for needed to have the drainage and the wetlands in place that were there. So they were not allowed to do any backfilling into those wetlands that were there, and we found that out early on, so that we did not put much more money into due diligence the moment that we found out. So it's each step of what their business model looks like is equally important during due diligence. So we're usually working on 3 or 4 things at a time.
Right. Though that sequencing sometimes, what I try to advise folks for, and what we look for, individually when we're looking at the physical condition, is what can we do rapidly to get to red light, green light? Is there something that's going to be a showstopper that we can look at first or assess first to determine, do we need to spend the time and the money to look at everything when this particular item is the thing that everyone's fearful of?
Absolutely. And each building is different, especially if it's building and not land. So you can walk into, I'm looking at a $3 million building right now that somebody's considering purchasing, and we already know the roof is really in bad shape, but the space is so large that that's going to be a couple $100,000 for them in the immediate. For us, who are not inspectors on the commercial side, they know that that's a serious pain point based off of the amount of money that they're going to have to put into their down payment and their capital and moving the space that they're in into the space. So they are having those conversations with roofing companies prior to even getting into any due diligence or writing any offers on the property, because that could be an immediate stop for them.
And often, if the due diligence is sequenced correctly, not only can you save money, often there's no expense at all.
Correct.
It's relatively simple to get a high-level proposal on the cost to correct.
Absolutely.
Even before, if you know it's necessary.
Absolutely, which is the case in this bigger building that we're looking at right now, is once they have a good understanding of that, we can try to back that out of what we're going to be moving forward with in relation to our offer. And so then we already know that we'll be able to correct that and fix that without it costing them anything, if the seller is willing to back that out of the purchased property.
Now, looking back over a decade or more of commercial transactions, I want to ask you about the ones that didn't close. Is there a category or categories of obstacle that tends to be the most common reason a deal doesn't get to the finish line?
It depends on the type of property, again, because I do work on so many different types of property. In medical space, it can be that some of these older buildings don't meet current medical. A lot of times, I guess use would be being able to help it meet what their business intends to do during due diligence. Zoning, a lot of the zoning work we do up front, understanding if the building is going to be able to get a certificate of use, we do that up front. Knowing the condition of the building, that's something that we get in the first couple of days from a good inspector. So really it comes down to financing the appraised value right now. Appraisals are all over the place right now. It's hard to... The confidence is starting to come back on some things. It's coming in really low on others. On manufacturing and industrial, a lot of those we're having no problems with. On churches, we're having a lot of problems on some of those right now, unless the zone allows for multiple types of use in that building. So appraised value and financing would be the majority of if it's not going to move forward, because a really good team is going to have a really good understanding in that first 15 days. I
find churches very, very interesting to work with, and interesting is a non-committal word, because there's this, especially from the physical plant part, which is our role in it. When you deal with the church, there's a few interesting things that have always popped up. One, that no one wants to be the bad guy. There's tremendous and intense personal relationships within that church community.
Absolutely.
You often have a large number of decision makers, and typically those empowered to make decision did not necessarily have the aptitude or experience to weigh in on that decision. And there's usually a group adamantly in favor of the status quo and a group adamantly in favor of change. And I've found some of the most challenging and rewarding work that we've done in the commercial building inspection world with churches. And the reason for that is the building is the building is the building.
Absolutely.
But the community that lives inside of it or is looking to advance it or looking to purchase it is so immensely diverse in mindset, skill set, that it's really interesting. I've had on more than one occasion to end up building a PowerPoint presentation on the objective due diligence about a particular church and then present it as a Wednesday night service. And it's very interesting.
It isn't. It's exciting.
It's
and
exciting.
so
It's
passionate
emotional.
About it. Mm-hmm.
And you get to the end of being as objective as you can humanly be, but you're speaking to people who, yes, they're concerned about the money and resource, but there is beyond an emotional attachment here.
Absolutely.
There's a legitimate spiritual attachment. And they ask that question that every one of us in real estate, in a sense, cringe at. And that is the question, and what would you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so funny going back to what you were saying between emotion for residential and non-emotion and commercial. Some of my most emotional and passionate projects that I've worked on have been commercial based because you have people's dreams, or if it's their church, every member within that church is so emotionally vested in moving forward with this. But you also have a lot of opinions going into it. So it can be, some of it's very, very positive, and sometimes you get a very diverse opinion on if they want to move forward or not, because you're working again with 20 or 30 people, and 5 of them may not feel strong about it, but it depends on where their weight within the organization falls as to what that matters and means.
Yeah, are they donors, or where they are in donors, and how many generations have been baptized or married in there? It gets interesting. I had one that was especially interesting and rewarding for me. I'll share with you while masking the specific detail, which would only be appropriate. The original church building was more than 100 years old. And for those 100 years, the good and loving members of the church had maintained it and done any upgrades that were needed. Virtually all work was done internal to the community, some by professionals, some by just loving people. Some of the professionals were operating at a scope far beyond their professional capacity. If you can see where that's going. This building had 100 years of love and essentially neglect and negligence in its maintenance. And that led to a crisis position where they were attempting to decide, do we tear down and essentially build a Butler building, which is what one group wanted to do. And the other side was, we need to save this. It's a legacy, it's our history, it's our familial past. We must save this. So the objective third party was us at Monument Commercial Building Inspections, and on this particular one, which was several years ago, it was specifically me. So we did all the due diligence you would do in a physical sense, not land use, that was all done. There was no purchase, there was no lease, it was we're attempting to make a decision. And so we did all that. And knowing that final question would be, and what would you do? I got photographs of the church I went to as a young boy, that my father went to as a young boy, and my grandfather went to as a young boy. And that church no longer exists. And I showed the story of the legacy of the building and me as a little boy there and these other things. And I said, that is now gone in favor of a better building. And that's the decision you're making.
Yeah.
Any guesses on which decision they made?
Probably to keep it.
They kept it.
My husband went to a church where he was in Boston, Massachusetts, where he was christened. His parents went there as they grew up. His sisters got married there. We had my mother-in-law's funeral there, and it mattered. It's a big piece of the community there. So it would be a decision that would be very hard to make, as long as financially it was something that they were able to make sure that they could take care of and still support themselves as a church.
Though they did cease baptisms in the baptismal pool until the defects that we identified were there. I thought, my gracious, you can get baptized and meet your maker all in one dunking with the condition. It was horrifying. It was wonderful that nothing bad ever occurred, but it was old Sparky in a spa. It was frightening.
And there's a fine line, that's one of the hardest pieces of working with some of the churches is we do have to have 2 meetings a lot of times, and the first one is how we look at this transaction with you as a business, and then how we look at you as a transaction with you as a church, and where you want to fit within the community and what you want to accomplish as a church may not necessarily always be similar to the meeting we had the other day with JWB when they were talking about some of the projects that they work on and what they want to give back to the community, and sometimes it doesn't make the best business sense. Same with this church. If it doesn't make the best business sense, as long as it's something that their church sees themselves moving forward for and they can truly afford it, most of the time that's the option they go with.
Yeah. And even beyond churches.
And not-for-profits are very similar.
Very similar. But things need to make financial
Absolutely.
sense. And to your point about the conversation with Alex and JWB was, if we go in this direction, we can easily have a 10, 12% return.
Absolutely.
If we go in this other direction, we're working on a 4%. But gosh, it's exciting, and gosh, it's good for the community. But they do that with open eyes. Where I really, what breaks my heart, whether it's a church, a nonprofit, or any business, is when you're surprised by the economics. That's when it's tragic.
Absolutely.
You run the risk of losing the building, losing the church, losing the business, whatever else was leveraged to move that forward, because there wasn't aggressive due diligence. And sometimes emotion clouded the due diligence. And that's why it's so important in the role you play, to a lesser degree, the role we play in the physical due diligence is getting it out on the table.
Absolutely. And how long they plan on holding it is a big thing, too. If they're only going to hold it for 4 or 5 years, sometimes a lot of that doesn't make sense. But if they can break even and hold it for 10 years, a lot of times their equity that they're going to now have in this property is somewhere between 30 and 50% of equity at the end of that 10-year period, no matter what decision they make, as long as they can maintain the property and hold on to it and break even. And if they're not making a profit, if they're holding it long term, it still makes sense a lot of times.
Right. Let's talk about something that you and I do together, work on together, and that is the Commercial Alliance of Realtors. And it's so interesting in the commercial space, and to a lesser degree the residential, about the silos. Silos meaning, okay, this group are realtors. These are my CCIM players. These are my NIOP players. And differing groups don't necessarily play together as well as they could for the benefit of the business, either between them or overall. And I'm very proud of your work in the Commercial Alliance to open arms to all in the commercial space, come together, network, and educate. So I'll flatter you on that and then ask you this hard question, that is, speak candidly about the challenges of an immensely experienced commercial person, as you've shared, more than a decade in underwriting of commercial transactions prior to transitioning and having more than a decade in actually putting the deals together. One about frustration, or you can view it about preparation of a non-experienced commercial agent, or even not experienced in a specific property type, and what that person can do. Yes, they have a relationship with this customer, but I get passionate about this, the importance of recognizing and knowing what they don't know and seeking the guidance from those that do know for the benefit of the transaction and the participants in it.
A lot of that comes back to what we were talking about earlier, is you're expected to have a team in place that will guide you and take care of the transaction that you're in appropriately, because once you're in this real estate piece after closing, you have this property, and there is not going to be the recourses that you have on the residential side a lot of times. So if you are knowingly putting somebody in a property that you do not have the experience and background within, then you can be setting somebody up to fail. For me, if it's just about the relationship, every deal that I do is more about the relationship than it is the transaction. So it's not this one transaction. Hopefully, almost all of my transactions turn into 3 or 4 transactions.
As it should be.
So if I have somebody that is trying to help, like my very first land acquisition transaction, I co-opt on that with a couple of agents that I knew could guide me through the appropriate pieces of that. And then I built relationships with them. I was able to get the transactions taken care of, and I felt very good about the fact that they got to accomplish what their business goals were through that. And I wasn't accountable. You do set yourself up for accountability if you take on some of that as well, and you're not versed in how to take care of that appropriately. Also, within commercial real estate, on residential, you have about 9,000 agents out there. On the commercial side, you really have about 70 or 80 really good players out there that are doing the majority of the work. So to build any relationships with them, you want to go in with an appropriate skill set or a team in place, even if that means reaching out to anybody, if it means reaching out. And my very first commercial deal that I had was 50 acres that I was lucky enough to work with another agent, Jessica Santiago Jones, and we went to our broker and we were like, what do? We have 50 acres. How do we put it in front of the right person? And that's how we got involved with Commercial Alliance of Realtors. We were advised to go into one of the roundtable meetings that they had, and we laid out this listing and we were like, okay, what do? We put it in MLS. Now how do we sell this land? And it was good to have a really strong group of commercial agents give us advice and tell us who to speak with and what groups we needed to look into and how we could put it in front of the appropriate people and market it appropriately as well. So it really is just making sure that you're taking care of the customer that you're with, on top of making sure that you're not setting yourself up for liability as well.
So an agent considering entering commercial real estate or new to commercial real estate that didn't have the background that you did as more than a decade in underwriting commercial transactions, where do they begin training-wise, association-wise, network-wise? If I said 2021 is going to be my year to immerse so that I pop out the other end of that as confident and competent, what path would you set me on?
So it would depend on what firm you're with. So the very first thing you would need to do is speak with your broker. Everybody's broker allows them to do different things depending on the firm that they're with. Within our firm, I would set them up with myself or with another strong commercial broker manager that's within our company, and we would come up with a business plan for them for this year. Maybe that looks like we set them up with a commercial agent and they start off doing a 25-75% split and being able to work on deals that the other agent's bringing in, but be able to assist them, or as they continue to learn how to write letters of intent and write the contracts, and eventually by the end of the year or the end of a 2-year period of time, depending on how much commercial they plan on doing, that split is more in their favor and less in their mentor's favor or whoever they're working with. Sometimes it's how much business they can bring in. There's some agents that work with their significant other or spouse is a general contractor and has 100 people that he can introduce them to, and they're bringing in a ton of business. Then maybe it looks like they need some type of a coaching situation in place where they truly work with a broker, so that broker can give them good guidance on those transactions and they're not always involving other agents. So everything's customized based off of what they're looking to do. I have a lot of agents within my firm that will give me referrals, but they just want to be copied into every single email and invited to every showing that we do so that they can start to be exposed to it.
Well, they're learning, they're supporting, they're strengthening the relationship. It's candid to say, and I'm Switzerland when it comes to choosing brokerages, because gosh knows we deal with hundreds during the course of the year. But it is also honest to say that there are agents with commercial aspiration that are it's more common with the boutiques, quite frankly, residential boutiques, where there is not the capacity to grow there. And that's an honest conversation, not for them to have with me, but to look at and say, are there mentors here? Is there experience here that I can build upon, or do I need to consider being in a different place, which is always an unpleasant conversation for brokers. I get that. But it's an honest piece of the mix.
There's a lot of people that would like to grow, and there's not enough resources in the commercial space available for them. Transparently, I assist probably 4 or 5 other brokerages with their commercial real estate because their brokers themselves do not have a comfort level on helping upskill their agents. So it's a conversation that I could have with anyone as long as I can speak with their broker as well. But there's a lot of people that are very hungry to get into the commercial space, and they just can't figure out how to break into it. So I would always welcome any of those conversations, and I can assist them.
I like that. I respect cross-broker networking, relationship, co-op, more than anything. It's getting everyone stronger when we're working collaboratively to build a transaction, to build the business community, to get things done. There's always positive.
And there's enough business out there for all of us. So it's really about just growing relationships.
So obviously you, as the I, as the co-chair of the Commercial Alliance of Realtors in the Jacksonville area, would advocate for more involvement with the Commercial Alliance of Realtors.
Of course.
What would you say to that experienced commercial agent, old guard, CCIM kind of person in a highly respected, strong commercial firm, and there are many of them in town? Why would they even consider coming down a rung to spend time with the Commercial Alliance of Realtors, knowing they're neophytes and predominantly residential at this point? Why?
Some of the really cool things that we've seen, and we've been lucky to see in some of our networking meetings that we do, is it only takes one person with one buyer to get a deal to work. So what we do in some of our networking meetings that we have every other month is we allow everybody to bring the deals that they currently have, the listings that they currently have, if they're struggling on something, to be able to bring that to the table. We have a lot of people that on the residential side that just have those one or two people. They don't have access to CoStar. They don't have access to the non-paid piece of Crexi and Build Out and wherever else all these commercial listings are hiding out. And so if they were to come to these meetings and build a relationship with these people that are looking for that one property they may have, or they may be able to build a relationship to be able to take that customer on as a referral if they connect with them appropriately. But more often than not, we've seen a lot of people, especially on retail spaces and single office spaces, and but they bring their listings to the table and it starts a lot of conversation, and everybody almost knows somebody looking for that space.
Yeah. The other thing I've observed, doing a lot on the residential as well as the commercial, is every commercial building buyer lives somewhere. And who knows where the people live are the residential agents. So if you've just sold an 8,000 square foot home on the ocean front, there's a high likelihood that buyer is involved in commercial in some manner. They're either an office tenant, or they're owning or buying a medical building or a strip center or something like that. And those relationships are incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. And this year, especially this year, is listing sublease opportunities for people who are struggling and cannot afford the rent that they're in those spaces. I have had a lot more residential agents give me those referrals than almost anything else this year, because they're listening to their neighbors who are struggling and they don't know what to do. And so I've had a lot of warm introductions that way, where I've been able to offer a little bit of relief and in the hope that they can get those properties.
Internal to your brokerage as well as cross brokerage.
Absolutely.
People need to respect and understand the value in speaking to your professional neighbors.
Absolutely.
A lot of things done. I'm going to ask you two more things before we go. One is, in prior to coming here to spend time with me today, what was the question you hoped I didn't ask?
What's the question I hoped you did not ask?
Yeah. What was that hard question?
Probably where I see commercial real estate within Jacksonville today, because it's such a gray unknown today. There's a lot of confidence coming back, but there's a really large gray blob.
Yeah.
Looks like. So I would not know how to answer you appropriately, other than
letting
you know what's doing well.
COVID question and the election question. You know, we've had an election that we don't have results as we sit here today. We'll likely have that solved very, very soon. But those unknowns are interesting. One will have a definitive outcome, that is the election, will be resolved on or before January 20th, I believe the date is. That's a for sure. The COVID, not so much. So we're seeing a tremendous shift in how much space do I need. I've had folks sit here with me in the studio say, we're going to need more office space so we can get people further apart. I've had others say, I think we'll have less. Just using office space as an example, we're going to need less because people working at home. I've had people say, this opportunity to work at home has a short success, and it's demonstrating the failure of not working together in teams. So the truth is we don't know.
We don't know. And I'm very confident in what each area of town is going for, how fast property is moving, but the busiest season is between now and February, and there's a lot of unknown with what that's going to look like in Jacksonville.
As long as we stay busy, ma'am, it's all a good thing, right? It's the movement of property.
Absolutely.
That's a good thing.
Now, industrial and manufacturing, they've been doing amazing this whole time, but everything else is just very gray right now.
Yeah. So my final question for you, I gave you the harder one before. What was the question I should have asked you that would lead to an opportunity for you to share what's most important for you to share?
I am not sure.
There's honesty, Nicole.
There is.
No
I'm
one would have
very
expected
grateful to be
less.
there. I've been very lucky to work with you over the past 2 years. Maybe the reason I do what I do and why I do feel that I've been blessed enough to become very successful in commercial real estate is just because it gives me the freedom to put my family first. It gives me the freedom to put these other businesses first and try to help them succeed. I'm very passionate about putting other businesses first and hoping that they succeed. And organically, I'm building really good relationships through that.
That's a great place to wrap it up. I want to thank Nicole Ryan from Exit Real Estate Gallery, head of the commercial division, for spending time with us. As you can tell, lots of knowledge, lots of passion, and a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
It was an honor to be here.